Next slide. And now I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Quang Tuan Nguyen. She is a board certified pediatrician and assistant professor at the University of Utah in the Department of Pediatrics and the Division of General Pediatrics. She's also vice chair of Health Equity, Responsibility, and Opportunity. She received her MD from UCSD School of Medicine and her pediatric residency at Tufts Floating Hospital for Children. Her research, advocacy, and education interests focus on early childhood experiences, working with under-resourced families, and supporting family units using frameworks of relational health and preventive care. Her mission is to empower patients to be seen and cared for in a humanistic health system that can ensure resilience, family, and community cohesion, and medical service that is individually appropriate and relevant. She believes that families who are the least resourced are the ones who are at most risk of longer-term developmental and behavioral and physical health issues across their lifespan. In her academic community, Dr. Nguyen has had a focus on education, working with med students and trainees, and her efforts have included workshops and trainings on bias, course facilitation on difficult themes such as racism and discrimination, parity, error, and justice in medicine, as well as advocacy efforts in everyday practice. In clinical practice, she's a general pediatrician focusing on children and families with special needs and disabilities. She's also an active member of the AAP board of Chapter 8, supporting building community with patients, families, and pediatricians in service of child health. So with no further ado, I will give you Dr. Quang Tuan Nguyen.
Thank you, Dr. Floyd, for that wonderful introduction. So I will confess that as an undergraduate student, I had always been impressed by how vulnerable the notion of truth was. I studied history of science because more often than not, the layers of culture affects not just the inquiry of the scientific process, but also the acceptance of the scientific process. I never thought this education would end up being pragmatic in any way, but here we are. And I sincerely hope that anything that I share with you today can bring you something useful for this journey that we have ahead of us. So I want to fully disclose that I do not speak for my institution, and I am not being political, but I will talk about policy and impact. What we're going to do is we're going to frame the current moment in the context of the history of medicine and the history of science. We'll spend some time talking about local, state, and national policy actions on medicine and science, and talk about strategies for continuing our growth, our innovation, and our own progress. So we will start today actually at the end, because what would better honor history than cycles? And I want to start at the end because I want to first and foremost share with you the depictions of two famous scientists and have both of these models present in your mind as we walk through our discussion today. This is a painting of the death of Socrates done by Jacques-Louis David from 1787. In this painting, what we have is a depiction of Socrates, the teacher, surrounded by his disciples. Socrates incurred the wrath of the political structures and ruling classes of Athens back in 400 BC. And he was instructed to recant his views or suffer the consequences of death. Socrates famously chose death. And here, what David did was paint Socrates on his deathbed with a student bringing to him a goblet of poisoned hemlock. That poison was what killed Socrates. Surrounding him are mourning students who are losing their teacher. And at the foot of the bed, you have Plato, who goes on to teach Aristotle and goes on further to really spark a lot of the type of scientific and intellectual philosophy, curiosity, and questioning that we think of when we think of modern day medicine. Couple hundred centuries later, we have Galileo. And Galileo was also brought before the Inquisition for his scientific work and his beliefs. At the time of the Inquisition, Galileo lived in a society that believed in a geocentric model of the universe, meaning everything rotated around the Earth. We know that that is not true. And when he proposed models of heliocentrism, which means that the planets revolve around the sun, it was considered heresy. Galileo was ultimately brought before the Inquisition and asked or forced to recant or also suffer death. In this situation, Galileo chose to recant and lived another 10 years and died of old age. These two models are really interesting when you juxtapose them side by side, because for many of us in medicine these days, the idea of the physician hero is an overwhelmingly large part of our personality and our professional identity. And when you are faced with the social political climate of the current times, you may find yourself asking, what am I supposed to do? How do I live my values? And for some of us in the room, speaking up or speaking out may incur a larger risk than for others. But yet the burden of that knowledge and responsibility is something that is much larger than our individual scope of being able to actually carry that weight. So with these two different scientists and heroes really of their times, you see two different individual decisions. And what they ended up doing ended up not mattering when you think about the arc of science. So yes, Galileo did recant, but ultimately truth endures and is based on something rock hard and durable. It transcends any one decision that any one person has to make. I hope that that lightens your load a little bit as you think about the scope of where we are at in this particular time. It does, however, center, or the question is really about community. So it didn't matter necessarily what Socrates or Galileo decided. It mattered who in their community carried on their work and their legacy. It was the community coming together to preserve, study, and further develop that work, where we have this arc or notion of progress in science. And so here what you see is, our heliocentric world, and then there's Newton with the apple and the notion of gravity. And then you have the development of solenoids, and heck, you even have computers. That's the large computer rooms that were the first models of our modern day computers, and even the development of an electric car. So all of these developments laid upon each other and were much larger than any one individual decision or person. And I don't know how to use AI to create video, so all it does is, kind of fall into the little dumpster fire there. And that's me being funny. Now, the community is a really vague concept, and it's not as easily packaged as some of the others. It's really easier to create the story of a martyr and a hero, and we see that starting in the 1880s with the rise of the scientific hero in medicine in particular. You don't really have stories of the physicist hero or the electrical engineering hero, but we all talk about the physician hero all the time, even when it's indirectly. The idea here is that a scientific hero is open, fair, unbiased, and exploring and seeing worlds that no one else can see. There's an element of danger, of sacrifice, but a noble pursuit of truth for betterment of mankind. And so here we have, starting in the 1880s, Koch and Pasteur and their search for the microbial world, looking through microscopes and discovering germ theory. We have in the 1950s, Watson and Crick discovering the double helix. And then more recently, we have stories of really courageous folks moving into the African Congo to study Ebola and these dangerous diseases. And again, to just help others and help mankind. But we don't talk about the stories that don't get told or the theories that don't hold water. So here you actually have a picture of the Tufts Floating Hospital for Children. Now, I trained at Tufts, and the old history is that our floating hospital was literally a boat. It was believed that if you use the miasma theory of disease, that the ocean water would be more likely to treat children with tuberculosis. And so Tufts was originally a boat. It moved inland couple hundred years later, or sometime later. The program ultimately sank because of, we'll talk about that another day. In the 1880s, and for about 100 years, we had the study of phrenology, which was the idea that your skull structure and the kinds of bumps that you had on your head predetermined your temperament, your abilities. And so people studied these things pretty seriously in the scientific literature at the time. And again, none of it held any water. But again, also kind of here you see these pictures of, who was more capable of parental love, what kind of physical features of the skull were more likely to give you those attributes. Here you have a woman who is drawn as being a good mother, and then another person being drawn as the unmotherly. And here again, that interlay between culture and what you think is supposed to be true, then scientific literature corroborating that at that time. And if you don't want to go back in time and want to look at something more recently, in the band Played On, there was a lot of discussion of HIV and how it affected mostly, it was a gay man's disease. And in 1993, Reverend Billy Graham famously asked an audience, is AIDS a judgment of God? And then he answered his own question and he said, I could not say for sure, but I think so. Again, that intersection between religious thought, social, cultural bias, and then the acceptance of scientific theory or rejection of scientific theory and process. So what are the stories that are being told now? So this is a recent paper printed in the Annals of Internal Medicine looking at readmission rates when you compare physician gender and patient gender and rates. So what they found, and this is recent from 2024, what they found was by and large, patients who are hospitalized in the United States tended to have a lower chance of readmission when they were treated by female physicians rather than male physicians. The differences were more remarkable for female patients than they were for male patients. At the same time that we have these stories, we also have other stories. So this is actually from the Kinsey report on women in the workplace. And they do this report every single year. This one is a summary of the last 10 years of work. And so there's a little bit more history and context to this work. But what you actually see here, and again, I need my bifocals. If you look at this first graph, and I don't know if you're able to see my mouse. So the first of the line graphs shows you the percentage of corporate offices that were offering advancement programs with content that were tailored for women. So, women brought value into the workplace. We're seeing that in some of the literature here in medicine. And yet what you actually see between 2017 and 2022 is that the numbers stayed fairly stable, but in 2024, the numbers dropped pretty dramatically. And we went from a percentage of about 49 down to 37%. And the story is worse when you look at programs for women of color. It goes beyond just sex. This is another graph again from the same report looking at commitment to diversity. And what you see here is in 2017 and 2019, the numbers stayed fairly stable when it came to gender diversity. So it was between 88%, 87%, but that we see a very sharp decline in the 5 years between 2019 and 2024. So going from 87% down to 78%. And when it comes to racial diversity, the numbers are even worse. They go from 77% down to 69%. A lot of the progress that has been made over the last 6 to 10 years are arguably being lost very, very quickly. And the data is showing us that conflict. And it's not clear yet what story will really emerge at the end of all of this. This is a really wonderful paper from Tom Valley looking at pulse oximetry in Black populations. And what Dr. Valley found was that in his ICU, the arterial gases he was collecting was not correlating well with the pulse oximetry reads. And so they decided to study this on a system-wide level at the University of Michigan. And what they found was that in Black patients, there was an error rate of about 11% and risk for occult hypoxemia. This was nearly 4 times the rate for white patients, where the error rate was about 3.6%. So that means that, ultimately there was an unrecognized risk for respiratory failure in patients of color. Again, this was, I thought, an incredible study looking at the structural reasons why things get decided the way they do in our systems and our structures. And yet at the same time that we may have excellent work like this in our literature, we also have reports from the federal government. So this was commissioned under Ted Cruz under the US Senate Committee for Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which quoted DEI as being division, extremism, and ideology. And the press release for it came out in February of 2025. Again, quote, Cruz-led investigation uncovers $2 billion in woke DEI grants. If you go further into this report and you look at the keywords in the index, so they started categorizing these words by DEI category, and it might be a little small for you up down in the audience. And again, this report is publicly available, so you can find it. But words like advocacy are included here. Words like bias are included here. Words like trauma are included here. Words like activism are included here. So there's a lot of language that is being collated and being made to be equivalent and to each other when there's no actual reason for that. And this really disrupts our ability to really define, study, and investigate those factors that contribute to patient harm or disparate outcomes in populations. And of course, we can't forget the controversies that are happening over transgender care. So this is a new HHS report that just came out earlier this month. And again, advocating for therapy as opposed to gender affirming care for kids who may have need for other kinds of care. And this is the actual copy of the full report. So we're living in constant tension. And if that wasn't enough, in 2013 in Iowa, there was a 17-line bill that was proposed. It didn't get passed, but it would have made it a misdemeanor to inject an mRNA vaccine into patients. This sounds really ludicrous, but then in 2025, Iowa and Minnesota, and I believe Montana, also initiated bills that were in similar vein. We also have patients who are requesting blood from unvaccinated donors. This is a piece from the College of American Pathologists talking about how that's just really not possible, and the kind of investment in infrastructure to be able to separate out and test these different blood donations based on mRNA vaccination versus, for example, natural vaccination or in previous infection. Like, it gets kind of a little ridiculous. And yet, despite that, we also have variations of bills asking for or requiring people to disclose if they've been vaccinated before donation. In Utah, there was a bill to build systems to allow patients to donate their own blood before a non-urgent procedure and have it stored for their use so that they didn't have to get anyone else's blood, namely someone who may have been vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine. And so it gets to be kind of a little bit more and more ridiculous. And then those bills did not pass, but then the fluoride one passed for us. So fluoride is now being taken out of our public drinking water, and because of the proposed federal bans as well, even oral fluoride supplementation has become controversial. So again, these are all cases where culture is really influencing the direction of science and the direction of our study and the acceptance of the things that we're able to find. And there's consequences to all of this. So back in 1910, Flexner published a report. This was funded by the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. And at that time, it was lauded as being a revision of how medical education in this country was being taught. And the idea was that it elevated the standards for medical education with a more science and research-based approach. What it also ended up doing was closing 5 of the 7 Black medical schools for students. And what that means is we believe that there's an estimated loss of it between 27 to 35 Black physicians in the workforce that would have otherwise been if there had been another path forward other than closure of these 5 medical schools. And that's pretty heavy when you think about everything that is going on and the consequences of what we do and how we respond. And in the patient safety world, there's a concept that I call the balancing measures. So when you design an intervention, you also have to think about what are the unintended consequences of those interventions. And you have an obligation to study and measure the consequences of those outcomes. You cannot just ignore or forget them. At the local level, I think one of the easiest things to talk about is book bans. So this is from Penn America, and this is happening in county, city libraries, school libraries, all at the local level, and an attempt again to kind of control or manage the ideas that a community may be exposed to. So it's not just schools, it's also library systems. So books that have been banned include The Bluest Eye, The Kite Runner, even in some places, To Kill a Mockingbird. And there's a lot of variation by state. So if you look at California, there were between 1 to 10 books that were banned between 2023 and 2024. But if you look at Texas, the number is actually in the hundreds, between 500 to 600 books that were banned. And if you look at Florida, the number is in the thousands. At the state level, I really can't do this talk without talking about House Bill 261. So in early 2024, House Bill 261 passed our state legislature. At the time, the university had been a very, I would say, progressive bastion, welcoming students and really putting forth values of inclusivity. If you actually take a look, you'll see equity, diversity, and inclusion were actually within our foundational pillars. On the way into the university, you would pass the stadium and there was a giant electric billboard that said racism exists, report it. There were a lot of efforts by the administration and senior leadership to allow conversations that had not previously been had at the university and academic circles, and really a student-focused approach for support. We'd been also very, very successful. So what we had seen was there was a 72% increase in diverse students, and the university was bringing in a lot of money. So we had a $6.7 billion operating budget with a lot of federal and national funds for research coming into the institution. And we were major contributors to the state economy and brought a lot of value to our state. Enrollment was increasing, and actually we had 27% students of color. But despite that, House Bill 261, so this was its second version of the bill. The first version of the bill had been proposed in the prior legislative year and had not passed. And so it was reworked and then subsequently passed in January of 2024. And it was labeled the Equal Opportunity Initiatives and just prohibited discriminatory actions that were based on personal identity characteristics. This bill, in some ways, well, I can go into personal opinions about the bill, but the bill made illegal things that were already illegal. Like there was no illegal hiring practices based on race. And so it was nice that they put a bill together to say that, but it was already, like we were fully compliant with civil rights law. So there were a number of things that were just kind of unsettling about the way the bill was presented and received by the public. In the days following the passage of the bill, our Utah System for Higher Education came out with some guidance, but there was sort of like an informal draft of the guidance that was passed around a few months after the passage of the bill. And because the bill passed in January and it was basically active July onward, our university was pressed to come up with some variation of an interpretation of this bill. So the sort of normal channels for being able to kind of come up with guidelines and interpretations that could make sense really didn't happen because of the rapidity with which the law was enacted. And so the Utah System for Higher Education had sort of a draft that circulated at the end of May, early June, and the university was forced to put some guidance out starting in late April, early May, because we were just 2 months away from this deadline, and a lot of units at the university needed guidance to be able to move forward and change programming appropriately. And even following those days, so this is actually a screenshot of an article in the Salt Lake Tribune, the higher ed commissioner had said publicly, yeah, the law doesn't require cultural centers to close, but it'll be inevitable. So what does that mean? Right. And so you're living in this really gray space where there's this hidden curriculum and you have to try to figure out how to navigate it while you have the responsibility of an entire university community. And you're trying to do your best, but none of this is clear. The institutions, the higher ed institutions in Utah include my own, the University of Utah, but also Utah State, Utah Valley, Southern Utah University. And so they're kind of listed here on the left. This would represent a small county in California when it comes to higher ed institutions, but this is our state. And what you can see is when you look at the personal identity characteristics that were called out in the bill, the closure of a number of different institutions, and there was a lot of variation. So at Utah Valley, they kept their Women's Success Center, but at the University of Utah, we closed our Women's Resource Center. We also lost our Black Cultural Student Center and we lost our LGBTQ Center, which had been in place for at least, I want to say 30 years. The Women's Resource Center had been around for closer to 50 or 60. So again, a lot of loss of programming that had been longstanding and very well respected in our institution because of the state law. And this is happening in a way that there can be a lot of disparate effects when you look at the national landscape. So for those who know, this is a map of, this is a tracker from the Chronicle for Higher Education. And what I did with this map is I overlaid it with numbers representing public institutions over the number of total higher medical education in the state. So in California, what you can see is 6 out of the 13 medical schools are public in nature. But if you take a look at the geographic regions in this country, what you see is in the Intermountain West, the vast majority of medical education is public in nature. The vast majority of public education in the Southeast, as well as the Midwest, is also public in nature. So these anti-DEI bills that are aimed at state education has a different kind of effect in these regional areas than it does in particularly siloed areas. Places like Texas, 11 out of the 13 medical schools are public, and 6 out of the 8 medical schools in Florida are public in nature. So really the only two beacons of light for us is California, where you're relatively sheltered, sort of, and New York, where it's 5 out of the 15. But otherwise, you can see the vast majority of medical education in this country is public. And then at the national level, well, within hours of the inauguration, we started getting executive orders, things like, this one, tasked with restoring a merit-based opportunity system. We got on Valentine's Day a Dear Colleague letter, which purported to charge that the Supreme Court Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard decision to be larger in influence than it actually was. There have been a number of injunctions and legal pieces surrounding the validity of the Dear Colleague letter, but it still put a lot of us into the crosshairs of scrutiny and alarm. And then, so that was Valentine's Day. And then on April 1st, or April Fool's Day, but it wasn't a joke, we also had the directors of multiple national institutes put on administrative leave abruptly. So the directors of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities, and the National Institute for Nursing Research. They were informed late in the day on March 31st that they were being placed on administrative leave, and together these leaders oversaw $4 billion in research funding. Some of them were offered posts in the Indian Health Services in Alaska, Oklahoma, and Montana. And if you look back again to the sort of merit-based thing, proclamation from January 21st, our systems are not like, we all come into this with individualized knowledge and expertise. You don't plug a physician from the Institute for Minority Health or Allergy and Immunology into the IHS and think that that's necessarily appropriate, that it's not actually the way of our jobs work. We've also had pullback of scientific research. And the New York Times, in the lay press, we're seeing words disappearing under the Trump administration. So where does this put us, right? So these are my suggestions going forward. I think these are generalizable strategies, and I think they also call out some opportunities that we have on the table that we cannot be afraid of approaching and starting forward with pretty much immediately. Number one, make your go bag. So when you look at people who are facing some sort of climate disaster or any sort of idea that there could be an emergency, you create a go bag in it. You have water, you have food, you have important medicines. Jennifer Bombush, who's a physician's assistant up in Canada and works with children and families with disabilities, talks about the fire events up in Canada back in 2023. And again, the families that did the best were the ones that had bags that had their trach supplies in it, their epilepsy meds in it, and had them accessible in such a way that if they needed to, they could grab the bag and they can go. We are in no different a situation where a storm is coming, and what you have to do when the storm is coming is you take a pause and you look at your schedule and you say, okay, I need to put the storm shutters up. Okay, the hurricane's coming. I need some sort of basement structure. We need to spend time digging out and excavating a space that is going to be safe for ourselves and our family when this kind of storm hits. It really is not business as usual. So all of you here in this room are experts in your field. You know what the major research has been over the last 20, 30 years of modern medicine. Create for yourself a go bag of your intellectual work as well as the intellectual work of your community. Think of this not as a package you take to another institution, but what is the education you want to give to future generations of physicians 2, 3 generations down the line. Make copies of it in your personal files, make copies of it in your institutional files, share it with your community. So if you work with organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, instill this knowledge in as many places as you can so that it cannot be easily removed or disrupted. This is, again, I think this is January, this was still January when we were going on to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and pages were just started to disappear. And it's not, if you look at the AHRQ website, references to race, language, ethnicity being factors to health disparity been removed. And so again, you know what the major literature is. It is your responsibility to save that literature and protect that literature. Just as if you are in a museum and the museum is going to burn down and you are the curate, you are the docent, the curator, you know the materials. Save the relics that are most important. Take them with you and go. This is one of the pieces that has most influenced me. I have multiple copies of it in PDF form. So there's Crossing the Quality Chasm. There's Unequal Treatment, which was published in 2003. And then there's a more recent work, such as this piece, looking at infant mortality and racial concordance and disparities. There's also this other piece that was published in 2023, and again, looking at mistreatment profiles. So what they did was they had a survey, but then they also had sub-cohorts of qualitative analysis, and they compared incidences of harassment by gender. And what you can see is even today in academic medicine, in pediatrics, where we're all really, really nice, the numbers don't actually demonstrate that. We still have a lot of room for improvement, and we want to. We want to do better by ourselves. The second thing I'm going to task you to do is to keep teaching. That is your superpower. So tell your stories, teach your patients, teach your policymakers, teach your students, teach your colleagues, teach anyone and everyone who will listen. I was blessed with a chance to hear Lucian Leap speak in my medical sociology class in my senior year of college, and it forever changed the way I thought about medical error. And he did a masterful thing. He, within the framework of the work that was at the NIH, kind of started to retell the idea of medical errors and labeled it as a human structure, and thereby opened up a world where we were able to talk about error in a non-judgmental and more transparent fashion. So frame your story and teach it forward. Honor traditions of teaching as well. So this is actually a link, and I won't play the video for you because it's a 20-minute video, but it is a Native American man by the name of Gene Tagaban, who is telling the story of community and hard work in the context of a story, and it's really compelling. There are many other traditions, such as Native Americans and African Americans, who will use storytelling in their educational process. I was at a meeting recently, at a national meeting, and someone said, but I feel so bad when I tell a story. It's almost like I'm emotionally manipulating them. And, we have been so trained to think about teaching in the form of graphs and charts and data and something that is objective. We have completely forgotten that there's another tradition of teaching that relies on stories, on discourse, on back and forth engagement of relationships. And when we ignore all of that, we leave that open for someone else to use, and we have basically handicapped ourselves by not allowing ourselves to think about this very ancient, very venerable, very much appreciated tradition of teaching. This is from one of the best storytellers in the world, Roald Dahl, talking about his daughter, Olivia. And he said, Olivia, my eldest daughter, caught measles when she was 7 years old. As the illness took its usual course, I remember reading to her often in bed, not feeling particularly alarmed about it. Then one morning, when she was well and on the road to recovery, I was sitting on her bed showing her how to fashion little animals out of colored pipe cleaners. And when it came to her turn to make one herself, I noticed that her fingers and her mind were not working together and she couldn't do anything. Are you feeling all right? I asked her. I feel all sleepy, she said. Oh, this is hard for me, especially now. In an hour, she was unconscious. In 12 hours, she was dead. The measles had turned into something terrible called measles encephalitis, and there was nothing the doctors could do to save her. That was 24 years ago, in 1962. But even now, if a child with measles happens to develop the same deadly reaction from measles, there would be nothing the doctors could do to help her. And this was published for the Sanwell Health Authority when they reached out to him for a public health pamphlet, and published in 1986. Again, the role of stories. go into your community. So this is, I'm actually really proud of our residents. This is one of our first year residents who, as part of our advocacy rotation, they write a mock op-ed. And what she did was she went a little further. She took her op-ed and actually published it in the Tribune this last week. And so again, go into your community, give your voice, and teach your community. And so those are other spaces in which we have to start to respect that education also matters. It is not just the education that is happening at the national levels in our academic meetings. And when there isn't a natural opportunity, create a platform. So this is Michael Faraday from the 1800s. So back in about 1825 or so, he started what became known at the Royal Institution as the Christmas lectures. And every year he would host, or he would have a colleague host, a series of Christmas lectures that were open to the public. And these became extremely popular. And later on, turned into the Faraday lectures. At one point in 1923, a version of this had 7,000 people in the audience wanting to participate. And at its height, back in 2002, Simon Mercer, who gave a Faraday lecture, what they did is they kind of did these tours of going between Glasgow to Jersey, and they estimated there were about maybe 30,000 young people who watched the live lecture, and then a couple million who watched by satellite. And again, these were opportunities for these men to give to the public an opportunity to learn something, and the public wanted it. And so it was a genius stroke for the institutions because it was a really effective way to tell people and share with people the reasons for science. And it also really encouraged the young, Michael Faraday did it because at the time there was very little organized education and very little organized scientific education for young people and children. And so that's why he did it. But there isn't any reason why we don't do the same thing. I think more recently we're seeing the Harvard lectures that are on constitutional law becoming public and freely available. I think something like 40,000 people have signed up for these lectures, but Harvard's been actually doing that for a long time now. And so there are a number of different ways in which we can say, how are we reaching out to our community and giving them education that they actually may want? Why do we assume that they don't want it and they don't want that engagement? There's data in history that shows that that is not true. And then the last thing I tell people all the time, especially in my work, it's easy to teach those who pick up an idea and start running with it. You have those early innovators and early adopters, and it's great to kind of come together and start jogging. And then there's the other group that takes a while longer. And you turn back and you realize that bell curve has now split into two different groups. And you have to kind of decide, do you keep jogging with those early adopters and those innovators, or do you turn back and look at the other group and say, gosh darn it, okay, gotta go back. Gotta stay in this space. And rather than lead into this space with frustration and with anger, use your pediatric superpowers and channel that part of yourself that is a healer and a teacher. That relationship is transformative. And teaching your patients, your community, your leadership, your legislators, your trainees, your neighbors, your colleagues, everyone deserves the gift of knowledge and deserves the gift of respect. And those are among the most meaningful that can be given. And then lastly, I'm going to say, move into the future that you want, yourself and your community. Whether you call it grit or whether you call it a mindset, I like to think about anti-fragile, which is an idea that for me goes beyond resilience, because resilience takes you back to where you were at. Anti-fragile takes you past that point to where you actually want to be. So challenge yourself to think about this moment as an opportunity to say, yeah, things were okay, but they could have been better. Why are we not still moving towards better? We can do this. And even in any sort of toxic environment, what we do know is that relational health, the capacity to develop safe, stable, nurturing relationships, can buffer and mitigate those kinds of toxic effects that we see children in their development and us in our career development and our work towards truth. So who is providing you that safe, stable, nurturing relationship? How are you nurturing them? How are you sustaining that growth and giving it to someone else? Because that is actually an investment now that needs to be done because of the environments that we are in. Recently, there was a letter from the, there have been so many letters. This was a letter that was penned by the Lancet in response to inquiry from the, I think it was the Justice Department, letters to the New England Journal of Medicine, letters to JAMA, the American Medical Association, and CHEST, which is from the American College of Chest Physicians, saying that the public has certain expectations and you have certain responsibilities, and implying that there's been misinformation, competing viewpoints, and the influence of funders in the research, among the research journals. And the Lancet, which is in England, this was a safe, stable, nurturing relationship, professional in nature, but still a safe, stable, nurturing relationship to us in the U.S. from someone abroad. And in the universities, there's also been pushes for, again, building those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, building defense compacts in case they get targeted. And I will leave with this mosaic. So this is one of my favorite pictures from the pandemic. And I want to say, as a mosaic, there have been attempts to divide us based on our differences, but we can choose the intention and the nature of our relationships. And I love this mosaic because each pixel is unique, but each pixel is unique and has inherent value, but its value is amplified when it's understood in the context of its relationship with its neighbors. There is no one individual hero here. And the beautiful thing about a mosaic is the same pieces with a different plan, a different intention, a different hand will create a different piece of art. And each piece is still true until itself, but by being flexible and relying on the community of its neighbors, it can transform into something else entirely. So together, we will grow old. And I just wanted to say thank you to my chair, Angelo Giardino, for his support in my work, as well as Jose Rodriguez, one of our associate vice presidents, my mentors at Harvard when I was an undergraduate student there. I never thought my education would end up being practical, as well as many of my colleagues in this academic space. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.